It is the 26th of January 1797. On this cold winter day, the representatives of Prussia, Russia and Austria came together in St. Petersburg to sign a convention regarding the final partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Although Poland-Lithuania had already been divided among the three empires more than a year earlier, the last outstanding issues now had to be resolved. These mainly concerned the remaining Polish national debt, pension payments for the former Polish king, and what should happen to the private land estates that were spread across the various partitioned areas. With this convention, the King of Prussia, Frederick William II, the Empress of Russia, Catherine II, and the Archduke of Austria, Francis II, drew a line under the drama that had begun in Poland-Lithuania in the late 1760s. During that agonizing time, the Commonwealth had effectively been a Russian protectorate, suffered from constant political instability, and was gradually robbed of more and more of its territory. However, it is striking that all three partitions did not take place when Poland-Lithuania was in a state of weakness, but when the Poles wanted to do something about their political incapabilities or attempted to regain their sovereignty. This was the case in the first partition, when Polish nobles had resisted the First Protectorate Treaty with Russia and triggered a civil war, and it was the case in the second partition, when Polish reformers had attempted to repair the ailing political fabric of their state. But this was particularly true of the third and final partition, when violent unrest broke out in the country, with the aim of finally throwing out the partitioning powers. This insurrection is known as the Kościuszko Uprising, and it marked a desperate attempt to restore the sovereignty of Poland-Lithuania. Despite its bloody failure and its disastrous consequences, the uprising still remains a core part of Polish national historiography, and its leader, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, is hailed as one of the country's greatest freedom fighters. But what was the Kościuszko Uprising? How did it come about, and did it ever have a chance at succeeding? I'm going to try to answer those questions and many more over the course of today's episode. The story of the Kościuszko Uprising begins with the promising start of a new era in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. On the 3rd of May 1791, reformist forces around King Stanisław II, August Poniatowski, had finally succeeded in passing a modern constitution, the first of its kind in Europe actually. It turned Poland-Lithuania into a constitutional hereditary monarchy, which extended some civic rights to townspeople, placed peasants under the protection of the state, and abolished the most harmful noble privileges, such as the liberum veto. The country had finally managed to free itself from the seemingly hopeless political stranglehold that had hampered it for almost a century. It would no longer be so easy for neighbouring powers to interfere in Polish affairs and keep the country artificially weak. The enactment of the constitution had only been possible due to the favourable foreign policy situation. The Russian Empire, which considered itself the protector of Poland-Lithuania, was embroiled in a prolonged war against the Ottomans and was unable to stop the constitution. In addition, Poland had concluded a defensive alliance with Prussia a year earlier, which finally gave the reformers in Warsaw the backing they so urgently needed. It was only after Catherine II had brought the Russo-Turkish War to an end in 1792 that she was able to concentrate on Poland again. She was aided in this by the fact that there were numerous Polish nobles who did not accept the curtailment of their privileges and wanted to revise the constitution. These reactionary nobles quickly gathered in St. Petersburg, where they consulted with the Empress. The end result of this conspiracy was the later proclamation of the Confederation of Targowica, which declared the May constitution null and void. A few days later, Russian troops invaded Poland-Lithuania to support the Confederation of Targowica, and there was never any doubt about how this conflict would end. The Polish army was hopelessly inferior to the Russian army. In addition to that, the Prussian king, Frederick William II, did not honour his alliance, as the Empress had offered him the possibility of a further partition of Poland. In view of Prussia's betrayal and the superiority of the Russian armed forces, Stanisław August had no choice but to capitulate and just hope for the best. His hopes were not to be fulfilled. In January 1793, Russia and Prussia signed a partition treaty and divided the territories they had claimed among themselves. Now the Prussian and Russian ambassadors in Warsaw demanded that a Sejm, a parliament, be convened to ratify the partition. And so it happened. The Sejm met in Grodno, in present-day Belarus, in October 1793. Although many of the deputies were in the service of the partitioning powers, Berlin and St. Petersburg had to exert heavy pressure to get their way. In the end, the Second Partition of Poland was ratified. Poland-Lithuania was reduced to about 1/3 of its original size before the First Partition in 1772, and from then on was merely a fragile rump state. But that was not all. The Grodno Sejm also formally annulled the constitution that had been enacted only 2 years earlier, thereby undoing almost all the political progress of the last few decades. On top of that, the Commonwealth was also permanently stripped of all its sovereign rights. In October 1793, the so-called Treaty of Constant Friendship, Indissoluble Union and Defensive Alliance, was signed between Russia and Poland. Despite its melodious name, it was nothing more than a treaty of submission that reduced Poland-Lithuania to a de facto Russian province. Russia was given the right to station troops in the Commonwealth, and Russian commanders could even take charge of Polish troops. The Russian ambassador in Warsaw became a factual viceroy who was in charge of all political matters in the country. Furthermore, the Commonwealth was no longer allowed to pursue an independent foreign policy. All this happened under the pretext of wanting to stop the spread of French Jacobinism in Poland. The beheading of the former French king, Louis XVI, in January 1793 caused great panic, especially among Catherine, and from then on many means were justified. A strict censorship regime was introduced in Poland, French citizens were subjected to regular harassment and constant surveillance, and the import of French literature was severely restricted. In Catherine's eyes, the May Constitution had been a first step towards the formation of a revolutionary government, and now it was necessary to prevent something similar from happening again. The fact that it was highly unlikely that French conditions could soon prevail in a largely agrarian country ruled by conservative aristocracy such as Poland-Lithuania was completely irrelevant to her. The French Revolution provided a convenient pretext for imposing one's will. Unlike in the first partition 2 decades earlier, the partitioning powers did not have to go through the trouble of finding far-fetched justifications for the second partition. However, it was quite clear from the outset that the new order that was established after the Second Partition of Poland was pretty much only temporary. This was also known to a member of the Sejm in Grodno, who announced, "Perhaps the time will soon come when we will have to cede for a third time, for in this century no one can rely on treaties and alliances anymore." And indeed, from the very beginning, a revision of the new circumstances was always on the table. Prussia's participation in the partition came about primarily because Frederick William II had threatened to withdraw from the war against revolutionary France if he was not compensated for his efforts with Polish territories. However, even after that, there was no firm guarantee that Prussia would actually remain in the First Coalition War, which was not going particularly well. Austria, which came away empty-handed in the partition, now also voiced claims for compensation. And last but not least, St. Petersburg could not be sure that Russian supremacy would last. From the outset, the continued existence of Poland-Lithuania depended on the course of the war against France. This became particularly apparent from 1794 onwards. After numerous costly failures, the anti-French coalition was now on the defensive, and with it grew the need to finally make peace. With the threat of losing the Austrian Netherlands, Vienna also increasingly looked to the east, where it might possibly be compensated. Most educated Poles will also have been aware of the possibility of another partition in Poland. Since the late 1780s, the educated middle classes, in Warsaw in particular, had become increasingly politicized or even radicalized. The first and second Polish partitions had been a wake-up call for many, who finally realized that things needed to change drastically. Political discussions had been the order of the day in the 4-year Sejm, and the future of Poland-Lithuania had been at the centre of the debates. The Constitution of 1791 was rightfully seen as a colossal triumph, and its violent abolition by Prussia and Russia caused widespread consternation. Particularly, the Russian occupation forces provided a source for much hatred. In and around Warsaw alone, 15,000 Russian soldiers were stationed under the command of General Otto Heinrich Igelström after 1793. These troops had to be supplied, of course, and the costs were borne by the Polish civilian population. Even in the bitterly cold winter of 1793-1794, the Russians took what they needed, with the peasants suffering the most. Despite censorship, news from revolutionary France spread rapidly. Of particular interest was the French Declaration of November 1792, which promised assistance to all oppressed peoples in Europe. The view that it was imperative to shake off the Russian yoke became increasingly widespread in Warsaw. Then there was also unrest within the Polish army. The size of the army was limited by the Grodno Sejm to just 18,000 men. The remaining 20,000 men of the army were to be incorporated into the Russian army. For the Polish generals and officers, this was simply unacceptable. After all, they had not suffered devastating losses during the Russian invasion of 1792 and were firmly, albeit slightly overconfidently, convinced that they could at least have stopped the Russian advance. They regarded King Stanisław August's rapid surrender as a mistake. The French proclamation offered the military the very last chance to turn the tide once again and to prevent the complete partition of the Commonwealth. It was a long shot, but it might just be worth it. However, the decisive factor in the Polish military's discontent was the appointment of Igelström as Russian ambassador in 1794. Igelström had already built up a bad reputation in Poland as a brutal, power-hungry man. In 1767, he had carried out the deportation of the most prominent opposition figures who had protested against the First Protectorate Treaty and was in correspondence with some of the most vocal advocates of territorial expansion at Poland's expense in St. Petersburg. Whereas his predecessor, Jakob von Sivas, had at least attempted to transform Poland-Lithuania into a functioning Russian vassal state after the Grodno Sejm, Igelström took a completely different approach. Based on recent research, we can now say with a high degree of certainty that Igelström was aware of the discontent within the Polish army, and even deliberately provoked it with the goal of finally having a pretext to annex the remaining Commonwealth completely. It was obvious to Igelström that the transfer of Polish and Lithuanian troops to the Russian army would inevitably lead to strong discontent. This becomes clear in his correspondence with Platon Zubov, the last of Catherine's protégés and one of the most powerful men in Russia. Months before the outbreak of the Kościuszko Uprising, the Russian ambassador predicted that Polish demobilization would lead to unrest, which neighbors would exploit and propose a new partition. He noted that one could act according to the Russian proverb, "Strength breaks even iron," if the necessity is more important than the consequences it causes. When anger in the Polish military reached its peak some time later, Igelström expressed his conviction in another letter to Zubov that there was no other means of bringing the local population to its senses than to proceed with a new partition of Poland. Plans for a potential Polish uprising had already been discussed in autumn of 1792, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had just unconditionally surrendered to the Russian Empire. Those plans were hatched by the same men who had been the masterminds behind the passing of the 3rd of May Constitution just 1 year prior, namely Ignacy Potocki, Hugo Kołłątaj and their associates. They had fled into exile to Saxony and refused to just sit and watch as their life's work got destroyed. All in all, however, they clung desperately to delusional hopes. They counted on the international situation changing again, on a rift developing between the partitioning powers, or even on another Russian-Turkish war, which could give Poland-Lithuania room for maneuver once more. Ultimately, however, it was the news from Paris that gave them the most hope. General Tadeusz Kosciuszko was received there in January 1793. Kościuszko had previously been granted honorary French citizenship and enjoyed widespread sympathy in revolutionary France. He explained the Polish cause to the French and asked for their support for an uprising. Although he was not promised any definite French help, he did receive words of strong encouragement. Kościuszko then travelled back to Saxony, where he presented his plan to the conspirators. In his view, the entire population of the rest of Poland-Lithuania was to be mobilized, and the army needed to be increased to 100,000 men. In addition, a militia modelled on the French levée en masse was to be established. But who was Tadeusz Kosciuszko? Kościuszko was born in 1746 on the Merechowczyzna estate in what is modern-day Belarus. At the age of 19, he entered the cadet school in Warsaw, where he was trained in military matters and the liberal arts. During the civil war that had broken out just before the First Partition of Poland, Kościuszko emigrated to Paris, where he enrolled at the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture to pursue his career as a painter. He returned to Poland-Lithuania in 1774 and began an affair with Ludwika Sosnowska, the daughter of a powerful magnate. The lovers' attempt to abscond and start a new life together was thwarted by Ludwika's father, and Kościuszko had no choice but to move abroad to escape prosecution. He chose America as his new home and joined the American army shortly after his arrival. There he made a name for himself primarily as an engineer for fortifications and was rewarded for his services by George Washington with a pension and land. His participation in the American War of Independence played a profound role in shaping his later worldview. There he encountered a society that was not characterized by feudalism, and he began to appreciate the American values of individual freedom and republicanism, combining them with the old Polish ideals of weak central government. However, Kościuszko often went further with his ideas of freedom than the American founding fathers. To him, all people were equal, and he was repulsed by the concept of slavery and the accompanying contemptuous worldview towards black people. When he received a substantial back payment from the American Congress in 1798, he, despite his tough financial situation, decreed that the entire sum should be used to purchase, free, and educate black slaves. Unfortunately, however, the executor of his will, Thomas Jefferson, would never be able to carry out Kościuszko's request. After his return to Poland in 1784, there was initially no indication that he would become the leader of an uprising named after him just a few years later. He spent most of his time on his estate and stayed away from political activities. At first, he did not participate in the discussions held by the 4-year Sejm from 1788 onwards and suffered from severe mood swings. It was only when the Sejm decided in 1789 to increase the number of Polish soldiers to 100,000 that Kościuszko returned to the centre of attention, as he was appointed Major General by the king. During the Russo-Polish War of 1792, Kościuszko managed to show off his skills. For example, at the Battle of Dubienka, he and his soldiers managed to defend the Bug River crossing against a Russian army which outnumbered them around 5-1, mostly due to their skilled use of fortifications. Even though the Polish forces were overwhelmed after a while and forced to retreat, Kościuszko was quickly recognized as one of Poland-Lithuania's greatest military geniuses. But he wouldn't get another chance to shine because just 1 week after Dubienka, King Stanisław August surrendered to the Russian Empress. To protect himself from arrest by the Russians, Kościuszko fled to Leipzig, where he began planning an uprising with the former Polish reformers. Ultimately, however, the conspirators in Leipzig and their allies in Warsaw were unable to thoroughly prepare their uprising. This was because the planned demobilization of large parts of the Polish and Lithuanian armies already got announced in mid-February 1794. As was to be expected, numerous Polish military leaders were anything but happy about this. One of them was General Antoni Madaliński, who was stationed with his cavalry brigade in Ostrołęka. He defied the demobilization order and instead marched his troops towards Kraków in March 1794. Everything happened very quickly afterwards because Kościuszko realized that there would be no further opportunity for an uprising. It was either now or never. And so Kościuszko hastily made his way to Kraków to rendezvous with Madaliński's rebellious troops. He knew that in order to stand any chance against the might of both the Russian and Prussian armies, his uprising would have to be nothing short of a national insurrection. He would need any man he could get, and in order to get people to his side, he decided to launch a social revolution, not just for the liberation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but also for its people. On the 24th of March 1794, Kościuszko arranged a rally in Krakow's Market Square. He was dressed in a national costume, and in front of a giant crowd of people, he swore his oath, which kick-started the Polish endgame. I, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, swear before God and to the whole Polish nation that I shall employ the authority vested in me for the integrity of the frontiers, for gaining national self-rule, and for the foundation of general liberty, and not for private benefit. So help me, Lord God, and the innocent suffering of thy Son. He was then proclaimed Commander-in-Chief, with extraordinary civil and military powers. Next, the assembled Krakowians swore to free the country from shameful oppression and the foreign yoke, or to perish and be buried in the ruins. A Supreme National Council was then formed as a provisional government, and a new system of conscription was introduced, and from then on, all men between 18 and 28 years of age were to be mobilized, regardless of their social status. The Russian troops wanted to crush the uprising while it was still relatively localized, and so the first decisive battle took place in early April, near the village of Racławice. There, the technically superior Russian army was defeated by the rebels. This was mainly due to a clever maneuver in which Kościuszko had his peasants, armed with scythes, rush forward and capture the entire Russian artillery in one fell swoop. To celebrate the victory and to boost his troops' morale, Kościuszko appointed the peasant Wojciech Bartosz as an officer, freed him from serfdom, and gave him the honourable surname Głowacki. Bartosz had been the first to reach the Russian artillery during the battle and, in a daring move, managed to extinguish the fuse of a cannon with his hat. Racławice was only a tactical victory, but the bravery demonstrated particularly by the peasants inspired Polish units all over the Commonwealth to take up arms as well. It provided a source of inspiration and would develop into a Polish national myth in the 19th century. On the occasion of its 100th anniversary, a panoramic image measuring over 1,700 square meters was created in Lemberg, Lwów or Lviv, which depicted the battle in vigorous detail. From then on, it remained one of the main attractions of the Galician capital. After the Second World War, the panorama was moved to Wrocław, where it was finally reassembled and reopened to the public in 1985. But that was just a little side note, let's go back to the 18th century. The news from Racławice had an exhilarating effect, especially in Warsaw. On the 17th of April, a revolt broke out in the capital, which completely caught the Russians off guard. 3,000 Polish soldiers and an angry mob of around 25,000 Warsavians armed themselves with weapons from the state arsenal and launched themselves at the vastly outnumbered Russian garrison. A brutal and merciless street battle broke out, which ended in thousands of deaths on both sides. Russian soldiers were hounded through the streets and mercilessly chopped down. The Russian ambassador Igorström managed to escape the carnage just in time, and he made his way to a Prussian detachment west of Warsaw. On the 22nd and 23rd of April, another big uprising took place in Wilno or Vilnius, which also ousted the stationed Russians, but in a far less violent manner. What followed was an orgy of revenge, which was directed against all who were considered responsible for the subjugation of the Commonwealth. This mainly affected the leaders of the Targowica Confederation, who were not entirely unjustifiably regarded as traitors. They included Bishop Józef Kosakowski, the nobleman Piotr Ożarowski, the field hetman of Lithuania, Józef Zabieło, and the leader of the Russian party at the Grodno Sejm, Józef Ankwicz. They had all played an important role in the Targowica Confederation and subsequently served, in full view of everyone, in the interests of St. Petersburg. On the 9th of May, these men were sentenced to death by the insurrectionary court and immediately hanged in Warsaw. All known collaborators later fell victim to mob justice and were simply lynched in the streets. In Wilno, another prominent leader of the Targowica Confederation, Szymon Kosakowski, was caught trying to escape by boat on the river Neris and was then hanged on the town hall square. Above him, the insurrectionists had put up an inscription which read, "He who swings will not drown." Among this euphoria which the victory at Racławice and the uprisings of Warsaw and Wilno had caused, Kościuszko was one of the few people who managed to keep a cool head. He knew that this momentum wouldn't last forever and that it was only a matter of time until Catherine would strike back in full force. In order to fully drive the partitioning powers out of Poland-Lithuania, all its inhabitants would have to support the cause of the uprising and join the fight. Kościuszko correctly realised that the millions of farmers in the Commonwealth would only support the fight if they were given something in return, and what they wanted above all else was personal freedom and the abolishment of serfdom. But Kościuszko also knew that this would greatly anger the Szlachta, whose support he also desperately needed if he wanted his uprising to succeed. So he needed to strike a middle ground which would please both parties. He discussed the matter in depth at his army camp near Polaniec with Ignacy Potocki and Hugo Kołłątaj, who had just returned from exile. The result of this discussion was the Proclamation of Polaniec from the 7th of May 1794. It was the most important legal act in late Polish-Lithuanian history, right alongside the May Constitution. Serfdom in Poland was now partially abolished and the peasants were granted personal freedom. All peasants who had fulfilled their obligations to the landowner were allowed to leave the estate if they so wished. The number of compulsory labour days was also drastically reduced, and all peasants serving in the army were freed from labour duties altogether, and so were their families. The proclamation declared that nobles trying to obstruct these reforms would be treated as enemies of the nation, though the decree was only sporadically enforced due to the chaos that prevailed during the uprising. The Proclamation of Polaniec was a giant milestone, and for the first time after centuries, the peasants in the Commonwealth were no longer the personal property of the landowner. Instead, they were finally seen as vital and participating members of the state. Not even the otherwise very progressive May Constitution dared to go that far. The proclamation was only possible because Kościuszko was far more radical than the reformers in the Great Sejm. He wrote that liberty could be defended only by the hand of a free people, and he was not scared to rely on spontaneous action by the people. In many ways we can see a reflection of Kościuszko's experiences in America in this regard. And secondly, Kościuszko was the leader of an insurrection and not simply a reformer in a state. This meant that he didn't need to arduously maneuver through the complicated political machinery, only to then witness his entire progress be destroyed by a number of corrupt and narrow-minded noblemen. But the Proclamation of Polaniec wasn't just significant in terms of its social progressiveness, it also completely changed the way Polishness was defined. Up until the late 18th century, the term Pole was almost exclusively reserved to the Catholic nobles in the Commonwealth, and was first and foremost an expression of status. Most peasants or non-aristocratic inhabitants of the Commonwealth would not have called themselves Polish, and the suggestion that they and the ruling Szlachta were all members of one Polish nation would have been absurd to them. Polaniec shook the old meaning of the term Pole. The term gets used very frequently in the proclamation, and it always deliberately encompasses everyone. Kościuszko's concept of a Polish nation clearly included everyone in the Commonwealth, regardless of status, religion, mother tongue, or wealth. In doing so, Kościuszko created a unifying factor and inspired all the people of Poland-Lithuania to fight together for the country's independence and to preserve their newly acquired freedom. This was something that many other Polish uprisings in the 19th century failed to do, as they were led almost exclusively by the nobles and served almost exclusively their own interests. In the words of the early 20th century Polish historian Adam Pruchnik, Kościuszko knew how to get a great deal more energy and strength out of the nation than did the later independence struggles. But we can't imagine this rallying call to have been particularly effective, because in the end it proved to be not much more than a collection of promises and fine words. The uprising would fall apart just a few months later. The insurrectionists knew that their whole operation would be futile if they couldn't get help from abroad. Kościuszko may have had the blessing and some financial support from revolutionary France, but he couldn't hope for French military assistance. And no other country showed any willingness to aid the Poles in their struggle. At the very least, the rebels could hope that Prussia and Austria could stay out of the conflict for the time being, as both were still at war with France. But this hope too was to prove illusory, because in mid-May 1794, Frederick William II marched into Poland at the head of an army. The opportunity of achieving a quick and easy victory was simply too tempting for the Prussian king to ignore. The Prussian and Russian soldiers then joined forces and inflicted a series of painful defeats on the rebels. On the 15th of June, Kraków was taken by the Prussians. Warsaw was then put under siege, but due to a sudden uprising in Greater Poland, the Prussians were forced to withdraw. While the Prussians had been dealt with for the time being, the military situation in the east looked anything but good. The Russians had assembled a new army corps under the command of the talented general Alexander Suvorov. At Kropczyce and Brest in September 1794, he decisively defeated the Poles and then headed towards Warsaw. To prevent the Russian advance, Kościuszko set out to halt at least one of the Russian armies. He was unsuccessful, however, and at the Battle of Maciejowice on October 10th, the insurgent leader was severely wounded and captured. As he fell from his horse, he is said to have exclaimed, "Finis Poloniae," meaning, "This is the end of Poland." While he probably never actually said this, it is true that Kościuszko's subsequent deportation to St. Petersburg sealed the fate of Poland-Lithuania. In late autumn, Suvorov prepared for the assault on Warsaw. He did not intend to capture the entire city, but only Praga, a district of Warsaw on the east bank of the Vistula River, because there the bulk of the remaining Polish army was stationed. On the 4th of November, the Russian attack began, and just after a few hours, Praga was taken. What followed was complete carnage. Many Russian soldiers stormed the district while crying, "Remember Warsaw." They wanted to take revenge for the Warsaw Uprising and committed heinous acts of violence against everyone they came across, be it soldiers or civilians, although it has to be said that during this time when most ordinary inhabitants were armed, that distinction wasn't so easy to make. The Russian soldiers raped, looted and murdered for hours on end. Suvorov tried to stop the excesses, but only succeeded too late. In total, around 20,000 people had died during the bloodshed. Suvorov then sent his terms of surrender to the Polish king. Stanisław August had never supported the uprising and had been unable to exercise any power during its duration. Absolutely horrified by the news of the Praga massacre, Stanisław August led Suvorov and his troops into Warsaw. The uprising was over. Catherine had triumphed once again. Stanisław August then asked Catherine to take Poland-Lithuania under her protection in the hopes that she might show mercy. But it was in vain. The Empress would not make the same old mistake of establishing a Polish protectorate, only to lose it shortly after. This time, Poland-Lithuania was to be wiped off the map for good. All my efforts have been repaid by ingratitude, hatred, and perfidy, she later explained. She had 12,000 members of the uprising deported to hard labour in Russia, and also ordered Suvorov to loot the prestigious Załuski Library in Warsaw, the first public library in Europe. Most of the 400,000 volumes were taken to St. Petersburg, but some were deliberately destroyed or got lost on the way. The Polish spoils were ready and waiting to be divided up. On the 3rd of January 1795, Russia and Austria agreed in a secret partition treaty to secure the largest share for themselves. Austria had come away empty-handed in the second partition and had also lost its territories in the Netherlands to the French, so now it could be compensated with Polish territories. The Habsburg Empire then expanded far to the north and annexed the important cities of Kraków, Sandomierz, Lublin, Kielce and Radom. The rulers in Vienna eventually named the area Western Galicia. The Russian Empire, on the other hand, was able to expand westward and advance as far as the Neman and Bug rivers. It thus obtained the last remaining Ruthenian, Belarusian and Lithuanian territories, including the city of Vilno. Prussia, which had proved to be an unreliable ally, had to content itself with the rest. The Prussians called their annexed area New South Prussia. At least Berlin obtained the old capital of Warsaw. The old Polish-Lithuanian state, which had played a decisive role in European history for many centuries, simply disappeared. In the convention, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, the partitioning powers also agreed that Poland should just disappear as a political entity, but should also be forgotten by the annals of history. A secret and separate article was included in the convention, which read, "In view of the necessity to abolish everything which could revive the memory of the existence of the Kingdom of Poland, now that the annulment of this body politique has been effected, the high contracting parties are agreed and undertake never to include in their titles the name or designation of the Kingdom of Poland, which shall remain suppressed as from the present and forever." 1 month after the partition, so on the 25th of November 1795, King Stanisław August signed his abdication. Seeing as he had no land left to rule, he left for St. Petersburg, a city he knew very well from his youth. There he became a virtual prisoner at the Marble Palace and never got any permission to leave Russia again. He died of a stroke shortly after, in February 1798, and was buried at the Church of St. Catherine in St. Petersburg. Kościuszko was not to meet such a swift end, but his glory days were also behind him. 2 years after his capture, he was released by the new Tsar, Paul I, alongside many other Polish prisoners. He initially returned to America, but came back to Europe in 1798. He settled in France, where he spent the next 15 years of his life on the political sidelines. He was never able to establish a good relationship with Napoleon Bonaparte, and was not given any role in the creation of the Duchy of Warsaw. After Napoleon's final defeat, Kościuszko moved to Switzerland, more precisely to Solothurn. He spent the last 2 years of his life there and died on the 15th of October 1817. And now, to answer the final question of today, how did the inhabitants of the former Commonwealth react to the dismembering of their state? The reactions were obviously very different depending on the individual and ranged from complete despair over the loss of personal liberties and privileges to a sense of relief that the never-ending cycle of war and instability was finally over and that new opportunities opened up. In the middle of that spectrum, you can find many people who felt a sort of apathy. After all, states just come and go, and the Commonwealth's time has simply run out. Those who famously mourned the loss of Poland-Lithuania the most were the poets and writers. Some of them believed that a life without their state was pointless and that a genuine patriot should die alongside his country. For example, Jan Paweł Woronich wrote after the partition, "Lead me in your black coat, O knight, to Cato's grave. He was the one who taught us what should be done when the motherland has died." In this poem he is referencing the fate of Cato the Younger, who had committed suicide in the year 46 BCE after Julius Caesar's victory at the Battle of Thapsus. In the end, most patriotic Poles didn't follow Cato's example, but Woronich's words show us that they felt like their world has just fallen apart. Many nobles even believed that the whole Polish nation would die out. After all, the Polish concept of the term nation was still mostly restricted to the nobility and only encompassed a small percentage of the Commonwealth's population. They believed that there could be no nation without a state, and within just a couple of generations, the Polish nation will be absorbed into the Russian, Austrian, or Prussian one. Some even looked forward to this possible development, like the infamously pro-Russian nobleman Stanisław Szczęsny Potocki. In a letter he wrote, "I do not speak about former Poland and the Poles. This state and the name of this nation disappeared in the same way as so many in the history of the world. Every one of the former Poles should choose his new motherland. As for me, I am Russian forever." Others, particularly Republican patriots in French exile, believed that the Polish nation would endure and that the constitutional Polish monarchy should be restored. They also believed that the Poles should continue their fight against the partitioning powers, preferably alongside revolutionary France. It was in this context that a popular song was written in 1797 for General Jan Henryk Dąbrowski's legions in Italy, which started with the phrase, "Poland has not yet succumbed, as long as we remain." This song would later become the national anthem of Poland. It is doubtful, however, that the influence of the exiled patriots was particularly big on the Poles who remained in the partitioned areas, as most of them decided not to put up resistance. In the Russian Empire, for example, where an oath of obedience to the empress was obligatory, the authorities only noticed very few cases of open refusal. But of course, this didn't mean that foreign rule was simply accepted, because refusing the oath meant that the person would be forced to leave the country. And so, out of a lack of any viable alternatives, most Poles simply swore their loyalty. For many, it was a highly humiliating ritual, as was noted by the poet Cyprian Godebski, who wrote, "I was forced to swear that I will not be free." A considerable number of Poles didn't necessarily see the partition of the Commonwealth as a disaster, but rather as an opportunity for advancing their careers. Particularly in the lower nobility, many decided to join the Prussian, Austrian or Russian militaries and served in the newly established Ulan regiments. In Russia, many Poles entered the bureaucratic apparatus and helped set up the administration of the vast area that the Tsarist Empire had taken over. Overall, it can be said that most Poles quickly came to terms with the new circumstances, whether out of a lack of alternatives, pragmatism, or opportunism. Open acts of resistance or defiance were the exception, and not the rule. However, the rulers in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg were greatly mistaken if they believed that they had brought the former Polish-Lithuanian lands firmly under their control and that the loyalty of their inhabitants was assured. There were many grievances that the people in the partitioned territories experienced on an almost daily basis. In Austria and Russia, the administration was infamously corrupt and abusive. In Prussia and Austria, the use of the Polish language was restricted in official environments, and in Prussia and Russia, the Catholic Church was put under ever-increasing pressure. Furthermore, a change of opinion took place among many Polish intellectuals. They started to be convinced that a nation can survive even if it was deprived of a state. The seeds for a renewed interpretation of what it meant to be a Pole, which Kościuszko's Proclamation at Polaniec had sown, were beginning to take root. When Napoleon's troops entered the Prussian partitioned lands in 1806, they were often greeted as liberators, and a wave of patriotic enthusiasm spread over the country. The same thing happened in the Austrian and Russian areas in 1809 and 1812. But, as you may well be aware of, these hopes were in vain. The Duchy of Warsaw, created by Napoleon, was nothing but a French vassal state and a provider of troops who were to be sent to their death in the Russian campaign of 1812. After Napoleon's ultimate defeat, the borders between Russia, Prussia and Austria were redrawn. Afterwards, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were still limited forms of Polish statehood, namely the city-state of Kraków and the so-called Congress Poland, which was ruled in personal union with Russia and enjoyed a great deal of autonomy. But even these were not to last long. After the failed November Uprising of 1830, most of the rights to self-determination in Congress Poland were curtailed, and after the failed Kraków Uprising in 1846, the small city-state was also annexed by Austria. The borders were not to change again for decades. It was not until 1918, with the collapse of the old order in Europe after the First World War, that an independent Polish state was created once more. And so Poland has indeed not yet succumbed, after all. Alright then, dankeschön for watching until the end. As you might know, making these videos is very difficult and time consuming, so if you want to make sure that I make more of them, please consider supporting me on Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon-exclusive Discord server and, depending on your tier, a number of other sweet benefits, like early access to my videos. In any case, I want to thank my invaluable supporters, without whom none of this would be possible. Marius Gerling, Lida Titan, Der dicke Flipper, Ich liebe Emden und Groningen, Maurice Lopez, Lucy Tara I, Rabienka Horatska, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Vidve, Pseudo-Riser, Lyle Furphy, Yin, Big Dave, Folling, Third Hambone, and Johnny No Cash. Have a very nice day, and I'll see you next time.